before sunrise. Still dark. A woman is walking through the streets of Jerusalem alone. The city is quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists in the hour before the world wakes up, when the air is cold and the roads are empty and the only sound is your own footsteps. She is not walking toward anything good. She knows that. The man she followed for 3 years is dead. She watched them take him down from the cross. She watched them carry him to the tomb. She watched the stone roll shut. And then she went home and she sat in the dark and she waited for the longest Sabbath of her life to end. Now it is the first day of the week. It is still dark, and she is walking back. Her name is Mary, Mary of Magdala. And if you grew up in a church, any church, Catholic or Protestant, traditional or contemporary, there is a very good chance that the first thing you associate with her name is not courage, not loyalty, not the fact that she funded the ministry of Jesus out of her own money, or that she was named first among his disciples every single time a list was made, not the fact that she stayed at the cross when the men had already run. The first thing most people think of when they hear her name is a word that never appears beside it in Scripture. Not once. Not in any of the 4 Gospels. Not in any letter of Paul. Not anywhere in the entire Bible. That word was put there by one man, in one sermon, in the year 591 AD. It spread through Western Christianity the way a rumor spreads through a small town. Fast, and without anyone stopping to check if it was true. It went into paintings and stained glass windows and Hollywood films and best-selling novels. It became the thing everyone knew about Mary Magdalene. And it was wrong. Here is what most people miss. The story of Mary Magdalene is not primarily a story about what she was before she met Jesus. It is a story about what she did after. It is a story about a woman who showed up when everyone else went home, who came back in the dark when the situation was hopeless, and who became, by the direct commission of Jesus Christ himself, the first person in human history sent to announce the resurrection. The church got her wrong for 1400 years. But there is one detail about that morning, about why God sent her first, of all the people he could have chosen, that almost nobody mentions. It changes everything about who she was and what God was saying by choosing her. We are going to get there. But first you need to know who she actually was. The year is 591 AD. The city is Rome. A pope named Gregory, Gregory I, the man history will call Gregory the Great, stands before his congregation and delivers a homily. A teaching sermon. The kind of thing preachers had been doing for centuries. In that sermon, Gregory does something that seems small. He takes 3 separate women from the Gospels and decides they are the same person. The first woman is Mary Magdalene, named, specific, a known disciple of Jesus. The second woman is Mary of Bethany, the sister of Martha and Lazarus, a completely different Mary from a completely different town with a completely different story. The third woman is someone the Gospels never name at all. She appears in Luke chapter 7. She enters a Pharisee and Apostle's house while Jesus is eating, and she weeps at his feet, and she anoints him with perfume. She is described as a woman who had lived a sinful life. The text does not specify what that sin was. The text does not name her, and the text does not connect her, not by a single word, to Mary Magdalene. Gregory connected them anyway. His reason, as best as scholars can reconstruct it, was pastoral simplicity. One composite woman made for a cleaner moral story. The dramatic arc was irresistible, from sinner to saint, from the lowest position imaginable to the foot of the cross. It was a powerful illustration of grace. And Gregory was, by all accounts, a gifted communicator. But it gets stranger. This was not a church council. It was not a papal decree. It was not official doctrine passed down through any formal process of the church. It was one sermon. 45 minutes of teaching on a Sunday morning in Rome. And that sermon rewrote the identity of the most prominent female disciple in the New Testament for the next 14 centuries. It traveled. The image of Mary Magdalene as a repentant prostitute went into the art of the Middle Ages. You can find her in painting after painting, red hair loose, weeping, holding a jar of perfume that belonged to a completely different woman. It went into the theology of the Western Church. It went into the way preachers taught her story, the way Bible studies framed her life, the way ordinary Christians understood her name. She has been called a prostitute for 14 centuries. That word appears nowhere in Scripture beside her name. Nowhere. The Eastern Church, the Orthodox tradition, never accepted Gregory and Apos as composite. They kept the women separate. They kept Mary Magdalene as who she actually was. They have celebrated her as the holy myrrh-bearer and equal to the apostles for 2,000 years. The mistake was a Western mistake, and for 1,000 years, the West did not correct it. In 1969, the Vatican quietly separated the three women in the revised Roman Catholic liturgical calendar. Mary Magdalene was given her own feast day, July 22nd, as a figure entirely distinct from the sinful woman of Luke 7 and Mary of Bethany. It was the right decision. It came 1,378 years after the damage was done. Most Catholics never heard about it. Most Protestants certainly did not. Then in 2016, Pope Francis went further. He elevated Mary Magdalene and Apos' feast day to the same liturgical rank as the apostles. He called her, officially and formally, Apostle of the Apostles, a title the early church had given her in the 2nd century, and that the Western church had buried under a lie for over a millennium. The correction was made. The damage, for most people, was not undone, which means there is a very good chance that what you think you know about Mary Magdalene is what Gregory told his congregation on a Sunday morning in Rome 1,400 years ago, and not what the Bible actually says. So let's look at what the Bible actually says. Magdala is a town on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. In the 1st century, it was not a quiet fishing village. It was a commercial hub, a prosperous trade town known for its fish salting industry, its textile production, its market activity. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian, describes it as a city significant enough to have its own hippodrome and a population in the tens of thousands. This is where Mary was from. This is the town whose name she carried. Pay attention to this. In the ancient world, when a woman was identified by her hometown rather than by her husband or her father, it usually meant one of two things. Either she was a widow with no male guardian to be identified by, or she was a woman of sufficient independence and standing that her own identity, her own name, her own place of origin, was enough. Mary of Magdala. Not Mary wife of someone. Not Mary daughter of someone. Mary of Magdala. Luke chapter 8, verses 2 and 3. This is the first time she is named in Scripture. Luke introduces her as one of the women who traveled with Jesus and the 12, and then he adds a detail that most sermons skip entirely. These women, he writes, supported Jesus and Apos' ministry out of their own means. The Greek phrase is ek ton hyperkononotais. It means from their own personal property, their own resources, their own wealth. Mary Magdalene was not a destitute woman rescued from the margins. She was a financial supporter of the ministry of Jesus Christ. She helped fund the operation, the travel, the food, the work. For 3 years, she contributed her own resources to what he was doing. This is not a footnote. Luke puts it right there in chapter 8, in the same breath as her name. And then there is the word Mark uses to describe what the women did for Jesus. The Greek word is diakonio. Most English translations render it as something gentle, cared for his needs, served him, ministered to him. But diakonio is not a soft word. It is the root of the word deacon. In the early church, the deacon was an official ministry role, someone set apart for service, recognized by the community, functioning in a formal capacity. Mark uses this word to describe what Mary Magdalene did. Not she helped out. Not she was around. She ministered. In the formal, recognized, official sense of that word. 3,000 years do not change what it feels like to be known primarily by your damage. To have people decide who you are before they know what you survived. Mary Magdalene had 7 demons cast out of her. That is in the text, and it is not minimized here. Whatever that meant in 1st century understanding, it points to severe suffering. Physical, mental, spiritual. Something dark and consuming that had taken up residence in her life. Jesus healed her. He freed her from something that had defined her. And then she stayed. She did not go home after the healing and return to her ordinary life. She traveled with him. She gave her money to the work. She was present for the teaching and the miracles and the arguments with the Pharisees and the long dusty roads between towns. For 3 years she was there. Here is what the text spends its time on. Not the 7 demons. Not the before. Every gospel writer who mentions Mary Magdalene spends the majority of their words on what she did after she was healed. She followed. She funded. She stayed. She came back. She was not defined by her worst season. She was defined by what she did after it. And the gospel writers knew exactly what they were doing when they put her name first on every single list. The night Jesus was arrested, the disciples ran. Not metaphorically, not spiritually. They ran. Mark chapter 14 is plain about it. When the soldiers came to the garden and took Jesus, everyone fled. The Greek word Mark uses is aphentis. They abandoned him. All of them. Peter followed at a distance as far as the courtyard of the high priest, and then 3 times denied he had ever known the man. Judas had already made his arrangement. Thomas was not there. The inner circle, the 12 men who had walked with Jesus for 3 years, who had heard every sermon and witnessed every miracle and been present at the transfiguration, were gone. The women stayed. Matthew chapter 27, verses 55 and 56. The crucifixion. There were many women there, Matthew writes, watching from a distance. They had followed Jesus from Galilee. They had cared for his needs. And then he names them, and the first name he writes is Mary Magdalene. Mark says the same thing in chapter 15. The women were there, watching. And Mark adds one word that stops me every time I read it. The Greek word is iki. It simply means there. They were still there. After the hours on the cross. After the soldiers. After everything. Iki. There. Joseph of Arimathea takes the body and wraps it and places it in a tomb cut from rock, and a stone is rolled across the entrance. And Mark chapter 15, verse 47, records this. Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Jose saw where he was laid. She watched where they put him. She did not look away. She did not leave until she knew exactly where he was. Then the Sabbath came, and she had to stop. Jewish law. No travel, no work, no anything from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. She waited through the longest day of her life. And the moment the Sabbath ended, she prepared spices to anoint the body. She was going back. The situation was not hopeless to her, or rather, it was hopeless, and she was going back anyway. Because that is what loyalty looks like when it has nowhere left to go. It shows up anyway. It prepares the spices anyway. It sets the alarm for before sunrise anyway. John chapter 20, verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. While it was still dark, she could not wait for sunrise. She had already waited as long as she could. She finds the stone moved and the tomb empty, and she runs to tell Peter and the beloved disciple. They come. They see the burial cloths lying there. They go home. The text is not unkind about this. It says the beloved disciples saw and believed, but it is plain. They went back to their homes. Mary stood outside the tomb weeping. She does not go home. She cannot go home. She bends down and looks into the tomb, and there are 2 angels sitting where the body of Jesus had been, one at the head and one at the feet, and they ask her why she is weeping. And she tells them, because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have put him. This is the moment everything changes. She turns around. There is a man standing there. She does not recognize him. She thinks he is the gardener. He asks her the same question the angels asked. Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? And then he says one word. Her name. Mary. And she knows. In the sound of one word. Her own name spoken by a voice she had heard 1,000 times, she knows. The angel did not appear to Peter. The risen Christ did not speak first to John. The first name spoken by Jesus after the resurrection, the first human name to leave his lips on the other side of death, was hers. Think about what that means for a moment. Jesus had chosen 12 disciples. 11 of them were still alive. He knew where they were, huddled behind locked doors in Jerusalem, frightened, confused, waiting for something they did not yet understand. He could have gone to them first. He could have appeared to Peter, the one he had called the rock, the one he had said he would build his church upon. He could have gone to John, the beloved disciple, the one who had stood closest to him at the cross. He went to Mary. He spoke her name in a garden before sunrise and commissioned her with the most important announcement in human history. John chapter 20, verse 17. Go to my brothers and tell them. That is a direct command. That is a sending. The Greek word for apostle, apostolos, means one who is sent. Hippolytus of Rome, writing in the year 235 AD, 350 years before Gregory and Apos' sermon ever existed, called her apostola apostolorum, apostle to the apostles. The early church did not invent that title centuries later. It was given to her within living memory of the resurrection by one of the most important theologians of the early Christian world. The Eastern Church never let go of it. Only the Western Church buried it. Here is the part nobody tells you. In first-century Jewish law, a woman and apos' testimony was not admissible in court. This was not a fringe opinion. It was standard legal practice. Josephus writes it plainly in his Antiquities. Women were disqualified from giving legal testimony. In the culture Jesus operated in, a woman and apos' word was not considered valid evidence for anything of consequence. Everyone knew this. The disciples knew this. The Pharisees knew this. The Roman authorities knew this. Jesus knew this. And he chose her anyway. This is the detail that undoes me. God did not look at the cultural moment and choose the most credible witness by the world and apos' standards. He did not strategize about who would be most believed, most respected, most legally admissible. He chose the woman who had stayed, the woman who had come back in the dark, the woman who could not go home because she loved him too much to stop looking. He chose a witness the world had already decided not to believe, to announce the thing the world needed most to hear. If you have ever been reduced to your worst moment, if someone decided who you were before they knew your name, if a reputation followed you that you did not earn and could not shake, you already understand something about what happened to Mary Magdalene. The church did to her what people do to women every day. They took the most complicated part of her story, flattened it into one word, and let that word become her identity for 14 centuries. She was more than that. Every commentary I have ever read about the resurrection morning focuses on Peter and John running to the tomb, on the burial cloths, on the beloved disciples seeing and believing. Almost no one lingers on the woman who was already there when they arrived. Almost no one asks why she could not leave. Almost no one talks about the fact that she was sent to the apostles before any apostle was sent anywhere. God saw her, specifically, deliberately, by name. In a culture that had already decided her testimony did not count, he made her testimony the foundation of everything. So what do we do with all of this? What do we do with a woman who was misrepresented for 14 centuries, whose identity was flattened into a single word by one man in one sermon, whose actual story, the funding, the loyalty, the staying, the sending, was sitting in the text the entire time, waiting for someone to read it carefully enough? I want to leave you with three things. And I want you to stay for the third one, because it is the one that matters most. The first is this. The lie was powerful, but the truth is older. Gregory and Apos' sermon was 591 AD. Hippolytus called her apostle to the apostles in 235 AD. The truth about who Mary Magdalene was predates the lie by more than 350 years. The early church knew. The Eastern Church never forgot. The truth was always there, in the text, in the early writings, in the title the church gave her before the distortion ever began. What people say about you does not rewrite what God said first. The narrative that follows you, the one you did not choose, the one that attached itself to your name without your permission, is not the oldest story about you. God and Apos' version of you predates every version anyone else has written, and his version has never been corrected because his version was never wrong. The second thing is this. She was defined by her loyalty, not her history. We know she had 7 demons. We know she was healed. The text does not hide those facts. But here is what the gospel writers chose to spend their words on. Not the before, not the damage, not the difficult season that preceded everything else. They spent their words on what she did after. She followed. She funded. She stood at the cross. She watched where he was buried. She came back before sunrise with spices in her hands and grief in her chest, and nowhere useful to go. Your worst season is not your defining chapter. Not unless you decide to stop there. Mary Magdalene did not stop there. She kept moving, kept showing up, kept coming back, and the writers of the 4 Gospels decided that was the story worth telling. Not where she started, where she went. And the third thing, this is the one I want you to sit with. God chose a witness the world would not believe to announce the thing the world needed most to hear. He did not fix her credibility problem first. He did not wait for the culture to change its mind about women before he sent one to do the most important job in the history of the world. He did not hold a meeting to discuss optics. He said her name in a garden before sunrise. One word, her name, Mary, and he sent her. If you have ever felt like you were the wrong person, too broken, too dismissed, too written off, 2 defined by something you survived, or something you did, or something that was done to you. If you have ever stood outside a situation that felt impossible, weeping, unable to leave, not because you had a plan, but because love does not always need a plan, then you already know something about what happened in that garden. He knows your name. He sends the ones the world has underestimated. He always has. There is one more question I want to leave you with. When Jesus said her name in that garden, just one word, Mary, and she recognized him immediately, what do you think she felt in that moment? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one.